Somewhere tonight, on a couch, in a bedroom, on a train, someone is going to pick up a small handheld device, press a button, load up a demanding modern game, and never once stop to think about the fact that the operating system quietly running underneath their thumbs is not the one an entire industry insisted, for 30 straight years, was the only one that could ever make this moment possible. And that quiet, invisible detail is the beginning of a story most gamers are living through right now without even realizing it, a story some people have started calling the second exodus. Because the first time an entire user base seriously questioned its loyalty to one operating system, it took decades to matter. And this time, it is happening in real time, in front of all of us, and almost nobody saw it coming from where it actually started. For as long as most gamers alive today have been playing games, there was an unspoken rule nobody bothered to. Question: if you wanted the newest releases, the best hardware, the widest compatibility, you booted into Windows, full stop, no real conversation needed, because the alternative had a reputation so bad it had become something close to a running joke inside. Gaming communities, an operating system built by hobbyists for hobbyists, plagued by missing drivers, broken compatibility, and the kind of constant behind-the-scenes tinkering that made it feel like a second job just to get a single game running properly. And Windows never had to fight particularly hard to keep that throne because there was, for all practical purposes, nothing standing in the ring across from it, no serious challenger, no real alternative gamers could point to and say, that's actually viable, until something happened that nobody in the industry expected. And it did not happen on a desktop computer at all. It happened inside a small handheld device that shipped quietly in 2022, carrying a secret most of its own buyers never even noticed. Because tucked underneath the surface of that device was not Windows, it was Linux, dressed up so carefully, so deliberately, so seamlessly that the overwhelming majority of people who bought it never once stopped to ask what was actually running the games they loved, and that, right there, is the moment. The crack began, silent, invisible, completely painless for the people experiencing it, which might be exactly why almost nobody registered how significant it actually was until much later. Making that experience possible required years of relentless engineering work poured into something called Proton, a translation layer built specifically to take instructions, written exclusively for Windows, and quietly convert them into something Linux could properly understand and execute, meaning the games themselves never needed to change. Developers never needed to build a separate version. The illusion simply worked, and it worked well enough that millions of people who had never once considered installing Linux on anything found themselves playing massive, demanding libraries of games on it constantly without a single complaint, because to them, it just felt like gaming, nothing more, nothing less, and that quiet success sitting inside a handheld device planted a seed that has been growing steadily larger every single year since, because the company behind it did not stop there. It kept refining that same operating system, kept expanding it beyond the handheld it was born inside of, and began pushing it toward full-size desktop computers, the exact territory Windows had never seriously had to defend before, working specifically with a graphics card manufacturer most closely tied to serious PC gaming to finally close one of the last remaining gaps standing between this quiet alternative and genuine mainstream legitimacy. And while all of this was unfolding patiently in the background, something else was happening on the other side of the story. Something almost nobody in Redmond seems to have fully anticipated. Because at the exact moment, an alternative was quietly becoming viable. Windows itself started doing something remarkable. It started making itself feel unwelcome to the very people who had never questioned it before. And it started with an assistant nobody asked for, wedged into practically every corner of the operating system, whether users wanted it there or not. Users on Windows began doing something telling. They started systematically hunting down every trace of this assistant they could find and disabling it piece by piece. Not because they hated new technology, but because they were tired of features. Nobody requested being forced onto machines they consider their own. And then came a detail so ironic it practically wrote its own headline. Because buried inside the company's own official terms of service sat an admission that this same AI assistant was intended for entertainment purposes only, explicitly, warning users not to rely on its output for anything that actually mattered, while that same company simultaneously charged as much as $30 a month for access to it and embedded it so deeply throughout the operating system that fully escaping it felt nearly impossible for a lot of ordinary users. And for a community already primed to feel skeptical about forced AI integration, that particular contradiction landed with a thud that echoed across gaming forums for weeks, because it confirmed exactly what a lot of people already suspected quietly to themselves, that this entire push was being driven far more by subscription targets and appeared to soften its position, only to firmly reverse course and reassert that same requirement as permanently non-negotiable, repeatedly framing it as essential for security while quietly ignoring how many perfectly functional machines that Decision permanently locked out of ever running the new system at all. And that decision mattered enormously because of timing, because the businesses relied on legacy software that had never been updated, because individuals owned hardware that failed the new requirement outright. And a meaningful portion of decision makers responsible for entire fleets of company computers openly admitted they had no concrete plan mapped out at all, while a smaller but genuinely significant slice said they were actively evaluating real alternatives entirely outside the Windows ecosystem for the first time in their professional lives. And instead of easing that tension, the promotional tactics used to push people toward upgrading only made things worse, because some users specifically began encountering full-screen prompts they could not simply dismiss, unavoidable interruptions urging them to buy entirely new hardware well before their existing support deadline had even arrived, blurring the line between a legitimate security warning and obvious sales marketing until the operating system itself started to feel less like a neutral platform and more like a storefront that happened to also run your software. And for anyone already growing skeptical of the broader direction this company was heading, that kind of aggressive intervention, embedded directly inside their own machine, only confirmed the suspicion. Eventually, the tension grew visible enough that the company had no real choice but to acknowledge it publicly rather than continue pretending it did not exist. And a senior executive overseeing the platform published something that read almost like a peace offering, renewing a promise to focus on genuine quality and pull back on unwanted AI integration going forward. And in the months that followed, some of that promise actually materialized. Prominent AI buttons quietly disappeared from a handful of built-in apps. Certain branding elements were stripped away. And yet, whether this represented a genuine lasting correction or simply a temporary gesture designed to quiet the loudest critics remained a real open question among users who had already watched this same company make similar promises before, only to watch those promises fade quietly once public attention moved elsewhere. Reliability. Problems piled directly on top of that philosophical frustration, turning an abstract complaint into something painfully concrete, because of the very first major update released that year introduced problems serious enough to force emergency patches, addressing unexpected shutdowns and application crashes affecting popular cloud services people relied on daily. A second emergency patch became necessary just days later to address yet more newly discovered issues. A separate update ended up disabling legacy hardware entirely without warning. And another security patch caused boot failures for a meaningful number of users with recovery options that were genuinely uncertain for a stretch of time, and for gamers specifically. A group unusually sensitive to any kind of instability given how directly it can interrupt something as immersive as an active gameplay session. This steady accumulation of bugs reinforced a growing narrative that quality control itself had quietly slipped in ways becoming genuinely difficult to excuse. And all of this steadily accumulating frustration eventually stopped being purely anecdotal complaints scattered across online forums because hard measurable data began confirming exactly what the frustration had been suggesting all along. A monthly hardware survey collecting real anonymous usage data from millions of participating users began registering genuinely striking shifts, one single month producing the largest one-month decline the newer Windows version had experienced at any point since its original launch. And while careful analysts rightly cautioned that some of that particular swing reflected users moving backward toward an older Windows version rather than leaving the ecosystem entirely, the broader multi-year trend line still told a coherent, consistent story. Overall Windows share among this specific gaming population steadily shrinking year over year, while the quiet alternative captured the clear majority of that movement. And longtime observers of this exact trend noted something particularly telling. The pace of this growth had been steadily accelerating rather than crawling along at the painfully slow rate. This alternative had been known for historically what once took an entire decade to move a single percentage point began, taking barely over 2 years, and the following percentage point after that took only a matter of months, a curve some analysts now believe could plausibly reach somewhere in the double digits within just a handful of years if a certain dedicated gaming hardware initiative currently in development manages to gain genuine mainstream traction. It would be a serious mistake, though, to frame any of this as some sudden dramatic overnight collapse, because the dominant operating system still commands an overwhelming majority of the entire gaming ecosystem, sitting comfortably above 90%, even after several consecutive years of steady erosion at the margins, and 30 years of deep structural entrenchment simply does not unravel quickly, regardless of how loud any single week's online frustration happens to be. And one particularly sharp piece of commentary circulating during this period captured the real underlying dynamic with unusual precision, arguing that a genuine mass departure will not arrive simply because online communities happen to be annoyed on any given day, It will only arrive, if it ever fully arrives at all, once the alternative has made leaving feel completely boring, completely safe, completely routine for the average person who just wants to play their games without drama. And that framing reveals something easy to miss about how this entire shift is actually unfolding. Because the real risk facing the incumbent was never a single dramatic moment where everyone leaves at once. The far more consequential risk is something quieter and considerably harder to counter. Ordinary gamers gradually, almost imperceptibly, ceasing to treat one operating system as the only credible place where real gaming can happen at all, and the challenger does not need to empty out the incumbent's entire existing user base to meaningfully win this long game. It simply needs enough people to eventually say, without any drama whatsoever, that their next setup simply does not require what it used to require. Real accounts scattered across gaming. Communities have steadily reinforced exactly this pattern. People describing games that ran noticeably worse after upgrading to the newer Windows version, only to discover those exact same games running smoothly again after switching to a Linux distribution instead. Others describing driver support and compatibility steadily improving month after month to the point where several vocal community members have explicitly stated they have no intention of ever going back once they made the switch. And none of this means the transition is entirely painless, because a real learning curve still exists for anyone accustomed exclusively to one particular file system and administrative structure. Certain professional software still lacks proper support, and a meaningful, frustrating handful of popular competitive multiplayer titles running aggressive anti-cheat systems continue to actively block this alternative altogether, forcing some gamers to keep at least one machine running the older system available specifically for those situations. But for the average person, whose library consists mostly of single-player experiences or multiplayer titles without particularly hostile anti-cheat restrictions, the practical case for switching keeps getting measurably stronger with every passing. Attention it deserves, because the company behind this quiet alternative makes essentially all of its revenue through game sales themselves, completely independent of which operating system the buyer happens to be running, meaning it genuinely has very little reason to care whether a customer is on one system or another, so long as that customer keeps buying and playing games, while the incumbent has increasingly tried to position its own operating system as a much broader cross-selling platform for additional subscriptions bundled together, creating a fundamentally different, more complicated set of incentives that do not always align neatly with delivering the cleanest, least intrusive possible experience for the person actually sitting in front of the screen. And that structural difference helps explain why one side has faced comparatively little internal pressure to compromise its simplicity, while the other has been steadily reshaped by broader corporate ambitions, stretching far beyond gaming itself. Developer behavior has quietly shifted in parallel with all of this. A growing number of major studios now explicitly list support for this alternative platform directly within their own official requirements, rather than merely tolerating it as an unintentional side effect of a translation layer working well by accident. Some studios have gone further, actively testing their own games against a specific compatibility rating before launch, because that rating has become a genuinely visible signal capable of meaningfully influencing sales among a rapidly growing dedicated audience, and this incremental developer buy-in matters enormously over the long run, because it steadily reduces the risk that compatibility might regress down the road. Precisely because more developers today are designing with this alternative already in mind from the very beginning, rather than discovering it works well purely by accident afterward. Meanwhile, corporate messaging from the incumbent has consistently emphasized genuinely impressive adoption milestones, confirming that the newer operating system had officially surpassed 1 billion active devices worldwide, reaching that number faster than its own predecessor ever managed. And yet, buried within that same reporting, sat a considerably less flattering detail. The specific business segment tied to this exact platform actually declined during that same period, even as other entirely separate divisions kept growing steadily in parallel, a juxtaposition that reveals something important hiding beneath the surface of this entire story, because having an operating system installed on an enormous number of devices does not automatically translate into a correspondingly happy, loyal user base actively choosing that platform out of genuine enthusiasm rather than simple, unavoidable default. And it is genuinely worth pausing here to appreciate just how remarkable this particular moment actually is within the much longer arc of gaming history. Because for the vast majority of PC gaming's entire existence, the quiet alternative now, gaining ground served mainly as a punchline among serious players, associated almost exclusively with missing drivers and endless behind-the-scenes troubleshooting that made it feel entirely impractical for anyone who just wanted to sit down and play without a fight. And today, an entire company has spent years methodically building the exact technical infrastructure required to turn that historical punchline into a genuinely credible mainstream option. while the incumbent has simultaneously spent that very same stretch of time accumulating a long, growing list of self-inflicted frustrations that have visibly pushed at least some meaningful portion of its own long-time user base to seriously consider, and in a growing number of cases, actually attempt exactly that alternative for the very first time in their gaming lives, whether this genuinely becomes the full, historic shift some of the more excitable corners of gaming media have already started proclaiming, or whether it settles into something considerably more modest and gradual over the coming years, likely depends on several factors. Nobody can predict with full confidence today. Full driver support from the graphics card manufacturer, most closely tied to serious gaming, remains conspicuously incomplete despite months of publicly stated collaboration, and that persistent gap continues to represent one of the single biggest remaining obstacles standing between this alternative and genuine mainstream desktop legitimacy for the large portion of gamers who specifically rely on that hardware, and whether the incumbent's recently renewed commitment to genuinely improving quality actually holds up over time, or whether it quietly fades as attention shifts elsewhere within a company juggling countless competing priorities will meaningfully shape whether the frustration currently driving this shift keeps building or gradually eases as real improvements potentially take hold. And it is worth remembering that shifts like this one rarely announce themselves loudly all at once. They tend to arrive quietly, one small individual decision at a time, spread silently across millions of separate households, until one day the accumulated total finally becomes impossible to ignore or dismiss as a passing trend. And what seems genuinely undeniable at this exact moment, regardless of exactly how the rest of the story eventually plays out, is that the once completely unquestioned assumption that serious gaming absolutely requires one specific operating system has now been meaningfully broken, likely for good, because millions of people are already comfortably playing enormous, demanding game libraries on the quiet alternative today, frequently without ever actively noticing that fact during their own everyday gaming sessions. And the infrastructure required to keep making that experience work reliably well keeps steadily, measurably improving with every passing month. And an entire multi-decade dominant position was built on the once reasonable assumption that gamers simply had no genuinely credible alternative. Worth seriously considering, and based on everything visible across this rapidly evolving landscape right now, that particular assumption no longer holds true. And it seems highly unlikely to ever fully hold true again in quite the same unquestioned way going forward.